Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at a couple of different kinds of layout containers in JavaFX. Specifically, we're going to look at the HBox and the VBox that we've kind of seen a little bit in other programs already. We're going to go through those in a bit more detail now, take a look at some methods that we can use to kind of reposition the items or the controls inside of them so that we have a little bit more flexibility or a little bit more control over how everything looks. In addition, we're going to take a look at the GridPane layout container as well, and we'll also see some of the methods that we can apply to that. Those will be very similar to what we see for the HBox and VBox. So to get started, we'll first go ahead and take a look at the HBox container. So we're using this HBox container to set controls in a horizontal arrangement. So essentially it's going to be a single row of content going from left to right. For this example that I've included right here, we are constructing a new HBox object, and inside of that HBox object's constructor, we're putting in our three controls that we want to be able to display inside of it, or that we want to have contained inside of it. So in this case, I've named them Control 1, Control 2, and Control 3, just very generic names. We can also see the scene graph for this. So we've got our HBox as the root node, and then we've got Control 1, Control 2, and Control 3 as three leaf nodes that are contained inside of that HBox. So to get started with this, I'm going to go ahead and move over to NetBeans now and start writing up the code to be able to create an HBox with some number of items inside of it, so we can start taking a look at that. So go ahead and minimize this. We'll go over to NetBeans, open that up. Inside of here, we'll go ahead and close out the start page. We'll open up a new project. So we're going to have a new JavaFX application for this. And click Next. For this particular application, since we're going to be dealing with the HBox and VBox containers or layouts, I'm going to go ahead and call this my container demo. So for the project name, I'm going to use container demo. Go ahead and finish. So we'll go ahead and create that. It's going to give us that default bit of code for our JavaFX application. So we'll go ahead and clean this up a little bit by removing some unneeded comments in code, so we can go ahead and kind of start from scratch with this. So we'll get rid of all these comments at the top. We'll remove all of these comments we're not going to need here. Taking a look at these import statements, we'll go ahead and get rid of anything that we don't intend to use for this particular application. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of those two imports there, as well as these two imports here. And the only three that I should have left are going to be for the application class, so we're always going to need that. As well as the scene and the stage class. We'll also always need those. We'll then go ahead and also do a little bit of cleanup on the style. So reposition the curly braces. We'll go ahead and remove all the content or that code inside of our start method. Reposition that curly brace. Go ahead and get rid of this comment here. And we'll also go ahead and take this main method and move that to the top of the class. That there. And then also go ahead and clean up the style. Okay, so now that we've got all this, the next thing we'll go ahead and do, before we actually get started with the code that we're going to put inside of our start method, I want to come up here and go ahead and import a couple of classes that I'm going to be using for this. So I'm going to go ahead and import the HBox class, since we're going to need that for our container. So that's going to be from scene.layout.hbox. Then also go ahead and get the label class. So I'm going to be using labels as the controls that I put inside of my HBox. Okay. Once I've got all that, then I can go ahead and come into the start method and begin by writing out the constructors. So we can go ahead and make our labels that we'll put inside of our HBox. So we'll have a label. For this, I'm going to go ahead and make three labels. I'm going to call them first label, second label, and third label. And this is essentially going to be for a couple of different descriptors about the HBox container. So we're going to do label, first label. So be equal to a new label. Say use HBox for horizontal arrangements. We'll then do another label, call this second label. This is going to be equal to a new label. So we'll say controls are placed from left to right. And then finally we'll have a third label. We'll have label third label is equal to new label. And we'll say make sure you use spacing. So for that last one, as we go through this, when I first get this all set up and run it, you'll start to immediately see why I've decided to include this third label here. So next we'll go ahead and construct our HBox object. So I'll have HBox and then call it HBox in all lowercase. This will be equal to a new HBox. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and put in from left to right, we're going to have first label. So this will be the leftmost item when we actually display this in our application window. We'll then have second label. So this is going to be positioned to the right of first label. And then we'll have our third label. So this will be the rightmost item. Next, what we're going to go ahead and do is create the scene. And we'll go ahead and put in the HBox as the root node of that scene. Let's be equal to a new scene, and inside of here we'll put in our HBox. We'll also need to go ahead and specify the dimensions so that this will actually display properly. For the width, I'm going to go ahead and start off by setting this to something like 1500. This will need to be fairly wide since we are going to be using an HBox and we have 3 labels with some content inside of them. We'll go ahead and test it with 1500. I'm not entirely sure if this will be quite long enough, but we'll see in a moment. For the height, considering the fact that we're just doing this with labels, this doesn't need to be particularly tall, so we'll go ahead and just do something like 300 for this. Next, once we've set up our scene, we'll go ahead and set the scene for our stage. So do primary stage.set scene, and inside of here we'll go ahead and put in our scene. Next we'll do primary stage.set title. We'll go ahead and say my container demo. And then finally we'll have primary stage.show so that we can actually start displaying the application window. We'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll go ahead and run this and see how this is looking initially. Okay, so right now we've got our 3 items up in this top left corner. So part of this will require repositioning this somewhere else. We can see that if we use 1500, that's more than long enough. By 300, that's also more than tall enough. It seems like I might actually be able to reduce these dimensions in a moment, so maybe make a slight adjustment later. But in addition to the content being pushed up to that top left corner, meaning that we'll need to adjust the alignment, you might also notice, if you try to read this, that when you reach the end of one of these labels, say like right here for the end of the first label, the next label is kind of mashed up right against it. So you'll notice that there's no sort of separation between them. There's no spacing between them. So one of the things that we typically need to be able to do with our containers is specify the amount of space that we want between the different items that we've put inside of it. So we'll need to go ahead and fix that as well. And in order to do that, let's go ahead and take a look here. So there are some different parameters that we can set for our HBox and VBox layout, such as spacing and padding. In this particular example, we're taking a look at that constructor that I included before, but there's one slight difference, which is that now, at the very beginning, for the very first argument, instead of giving it a some kind of control to specify something that needs to be contained inside of it, I'm giving it an integer value. And that integer value is going to specify the amount of spacing that I want to place between the different items in that container. So in this case, if we use this as an example, we're placing 10 pixels of spacing between each one of our different controls. So let's go ahead and test that out. So we'll go ahead and modify the alignment and the spacing. So we can go ahead and get the spacing out of the way now. It's fairly straightforward. We'll go ahead and try the same amount. We'll do 10 pixels right here. In addition to that, we'll also go ahead and set up the the alignment. So in order to do that, we're going to need to get the pause class. So we'll do JavaFX.geometry.pause. And then coming down here, after we've created our HBox, just underneath it, we'll go ahead and set the alignment. And for this one, we'll again just go ahead and use center. So we'll do pause.center. And when I do pause.center for this, since we have multiple items, the way this is going to work is that each item essentially has its own individual kind of box within that HBox, and it's going to be centered within that particular space that is reserved just for it. So when we do this, you'll notice that each one of them is kind of centered somewhat in its own little space, with that little bit of spacing kind of in between those items. So we'll go ahead and run this. And so now we can actually see it with the items placed in the center, and now you can see that little bit of spacing that's separating the individual items. Okay. So that's going to cover the spacing. The other thing to take note of that is mentioned right here is also going to be padding. So in order to add padding to a container or to the surrounding perimeter of a container, we're going to need to use the insets class. So this insets constructor can actually take two different types of arguments. So I've got two different versions of the constructor for insets. The first one is if we give it just a single argument. In that case, it's going to take whatever value I've specified and use that to apply padding to all four sides of my container. So every container, or really every container, every control, everything in a GUI application has a top, right, bottom, and left. So it's got four sides surrounding it. In this case, if we give it just a single argument in that insets constructor, it's going to apply that same amount of padding to all four sides. Alternatively, if you want to be able to specify different amounts of padding for each of those four individual sides, you can actually break this up into four arguments, in which case each one of those is going to go, if we go from left to right on this, is going to go top, right, bottom, and left. So it's essentially starting from the top for the first argument and then going clockwise to get to the last argument. So the example that I'm using here, where I specified 10 for all four of those arguments, that's basically the equivalent of what I'm doing for the first constructor as well, where I'm giving it just one argument. So let's go ahead and take a look at this with each one of those two different kinds of constructions. So I'll go ahead and minimize this again, come back over here. And so in order to do this, I need to go ahead and import that insets class. So in addition to pause, we'll do javafx.geometry.insets. And then down here, after I specified the alignment, let's say that instead of specifying the alignment, go ahead and comment that out. And underneath this, we'll go ahead and specify some padding instead to try to use that to maybe move the content away from that upper leftmost edge of our application window. So we'll do HBox.setPadding. Inside of here, we'll have a new insets. And to start off with, we'll go ahead and do this with just 10 pixels all around. We'll go ahead and save that, and then we'll run it. So if we do that, now we can see that it's no longer being positioned in the center since we removed the alignment that we set. But we'll also notice that it's not pushed up right against the leftmost edge anymore. You notice that there's a little bit of spacing between that edge and the actual HBox container. So that little bit of spacing we have right there now, that's going to be the padding that surrounds it. So in this case, we're doing 10 pixels on the top. You won't really be able to see it here, but there's also going to be 10 pixels on the right, another 10 pixels on the bottom, and then 10 pixels on the left. So then if we wanted to go ahead and specify this individually, we could go ahead and do that as well. So let's say for this one, to be able to actually see this, I'm going to do 10 pixels for the top, but then let's do 0 for everything else. And the main one that you're going to notice is for this last argument. If I specify 0 pixels of padding for the left, then we'll see that it's no longer touching against the topmost edge, but it will be up against the leftmost edge. So go ahead and run that. And you can see that here now. So we've got our 10 pixels of padding on the top, but we removed any padding on the left. So that kind of shows you the two different ways that we can go about constructing an insets object. Alright, so at this point I'm going to go ahead and comment this line out, bring this line back in. We're going to go ahead and keep this center alignment for our HBox. The primary reason for that is because now, since we've done this HBox, I want to go ahead and get into the VBox container. And I'm going to go ahead and add on some more content to this current application to do that. So with the VBox container, this is going to be another layout container used to set controls in a vertical arrangement. So it's going to go from top to bottom. So we can see here we've got our constructor, and we've got another scene graph showing the hierarchy of our VBox as the root node, and then our three controls, control 1, control 2, and control 3 as the leaf nodes. In this particular case, control 1 is going to be the topmost element, or the topmost control. Control 2 will then be in the middle vertically, and then control 3 is going to be at the bottom. So let's go ahead and start adding some more content to our application by incorporating a VBox. So we'll come back over to NetBeans. And so to start off with, since we're going to be adding another container to this, we'll go ahead and import that container as well. This will be the VBox. And then what I'm going to go ahead and do is use this VBox to add both my HBox, and we're going to go ahead and introduce two more labels. So we'll go ahead and try to combine all of this content. So to get started, we'll first go ahead and add two more labels to this. So we've got our first, second, and third label already. We'll go ahead and make a fourth and a fifth. So our fourth label equal to new label. For these two, I'm just going to go ahead and provide some very quick, simple descriptions about the VBox. So this first one will say use VBox for vertical arrangements. And then I'll do label fifth label, and this will be equal to a new label. And for this one, we'll go ahead and do controls are placed from top to bottom. Okay. Once we've got all that, then after we've made our HBox, we'll go ahead and also make our VBox. So right here, we'll create a new VBox. We'll go ahead and use the same naming convention as our HBox, just the name in all lowercase. This will be equal to a new VBox. And inside of this one, what I'm going to want is for this HBox to be the top item of content inside of it. And then underneath that, we're going to have our fourth label. And then underneath that, at the very bottom of this VBox, we're going to have the fifth label. So to do this, we're just going to put the HBox in first. So we'll be able to add one container to another. I'll talk briefly about this, this idea of nesting containers in a moment. But we'll also be able to see what this looks like once we actually run the application. Underneath the HBox, we'll have fourth label. And then underneath the fourth label, we'll have fifth label. In addition to adding these three items to it, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing we did with the HBox. We're going to give it a little bit of spacing. So we'll go ahead and modify the very first argument so that we'll go ahead and just do 10 pixels of spacing for it. And then underneath this, we will also, just like with our HBox, go ahead and set the alignment for our VBox as well, just to make sure that the items are going to be centered within this container too. Particularly because of the fact that, say, like fourth label and fifth label, we haven't specified any kind of alignment for these, so we want to go ahead and do that now. So do VBox.setAlignment, and we'll do pause.center. The last thing I need to go ahead and do, since I'm now putting the HBox inside of the VBox, this means that now the VBox is actually going to be the container that holds all of the content for my scene, for my application. So that means that I also need to go ahead and modify the root node that I specified for my scene right here. So now instead of doing the HBox, I need to go ahead and make it the VBox. So go ahead and save that. And now with all this set up, we'll go ahead and run this application and see how this looks. So go ahead and run it. And so now with the way that this is set up, we see that we've got our HBox at the very top. So we've got our 3 items from that HBox, using HBox for horizontal arrangements, controls placed from left to right, make sure you use spacing. And then underneath that, we're going to see our 5th label, use VBox for vertical arrangements. And then underneath that, we have this was our 4th label, and then underneath that is our 5th label. Controls are placed from top to bottom. So in a moment, I'll also go ahead and include the scene graph and a fairly simple kind of boxed in sketch of what this application should be looking like to kind of break down the positioning of each one of these different items relative to the others, and also talk a little bit about the hierarchy when you start using nested containers like this. But before I do that, the next thing I want to go ahead and address is the final container that we're going to look at, which is going to be that GridPane layout. So we'll go ahead and close this. We'll come back over to the slides. And getting into the next slide, we're going to be talking a little bit about the GridPane layout. So this container is used to set controls in a 2-dimensional grid of rows and columns. Whenever you actually make a GridPane, the constructor for it actually doesn't take any arguments. So you will initially create an empty GridPane, and then you're going to use the add method on that GridPane object that you just constructed to add content to your GridPane. So we can see a quick and simple example right here where we've constructed our empty GridPane. I've included this initialization of a column and a row. So we're doing like column 1, row 0 to specify a particular position somewhere in our GridPane. And then we go ahead and add that. And the way that you're going to go about adding it, you're going to specify the control that you want to add to your GridPane, and you're also going to specify the position as a column number and a row number. So similar to our arrays, you'll notice that the column and row numbers are 0 based. So if we look at this little grid that I've constructed here, you'll see column 0, row 0 in that upper left corner. Going to the right of that is where our control is going to be placed. That's at column 1, row 0. Then if we go to the right again, we have column 2, row 0. If you then step down to the next row, that's going to be going through column 0, row 1, column 1, row 1, and column 2, row 1. And obviously, if you're trying to just imagine in the abstract the different rows and columns of a GridPane, since it's initially set to be empty and you just slowly specify content wherever you want to position it, you could technically imagine this as just being infinitely many rows and columns, and you're just going to use as many as you need. So in order to demonstrate this, I want to go ahead and make a different application for this. We're going to create a totally new project. So we'll go ahead and minimize this one. We'll go ahead and close out our container demo. And we'll go ahead and create a new JavaFX application. Click Next. And for this one, I'll keep this one's description fairly simple. It's for the project name. I'll just call this cooking. Go ahead and finish that. So for this new project, we'll go ahead and start by cleaning this up, removing anything that we don't need. So we'll go ahead and delete this. We'll go ahead and remove the extra imports that we're not going to need. Go ahead and remove this extra comment. Go ahead and reposition the curly braces. We'll remove all of the content inside of our start method. We'll also go ahead and remove this comment and then reposition the main method. Okay. So now that we've got everything set up, so right here, we'll go ahead and start by including all of the import statements for the things that we're going to need. So for this particular application, we're going to be working with the GridPane layout, and then the 2 controls that I want to be adding to this. We're going to include labels again, but I'm also going to include some images for this. So we'll go ahead and do an import javafx.scene.layout.gridpane. So this is going to be the import to be able to go get that GridPane layout. Just like the HBox and the VBox, it's going to be coming from that layout package. Underneath this, we'll go ahead and do an import for our label. And then we'll also include both of those import statements that we need for images. So we'll be getting the image and the image view classes. So do import javafx.scene.image.image, and then import javafx.scene.image.imageView. Okay. So once we've got all this, then inside of our stage, let's start by creating the two labels that we're going to use for this. So the first one, I'm going to call this my intro label. So this is going to be the label that serves as kind of an introduction to this application. So for this one, let's start with something like welcome to my cooking app. Let's get you started. So this will be a new label. Make sure that we actually construct that and put the string inside of it. The other thing we're going to do, so the second label will be for getting started with maybe the first meal that you learn to cook with this. So the very first thing that we're going to need will be the ingredients. So just do ing, short for ingredients, label. So equal to new label. Inside of here, we'll just say, here are your ingredients. And then after that, you'd have some kind of maybe bulleted list of all the different ingredients that you'll need for your meal. For this next part, what we're going to need to do is bring in our images. So we'll need to use the image class to load them, and then the image view class to be able to display them later. So in order to do this, we need to make sure that we actually have some images. So I actually have two images that I want to use right here. So I'm going to go ahead and grab both of these. So go ahead and just cut both of those. I'll then go ahead and add these to my project directory for this cooking project. Going to NetBeans projects, going to cooking. So I'll add it to this project directory right here. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder. Since I have multiple images, I want to go ahead and make a folder to store those in. For this, I'll just call this images. We'll go ahead and open that, and we will put both of those images there. So now, whenever I want to access these, since I've not put them, these images are not directly in that project directory, I'll need to make sure that I specify the file path. So let's go ahead and minimize this for a moment. So we'll come over here and try to set that up. So we'll have image. So the first one will be our intro image. So it'll be equal to a new image. And as I mentioned before, if we want to be able to load an image from our computer system, we're going to use that file protocol. So do file and then a colon. And then, as I mentioned, they're not going to be directly in the project directory, so we'll need to specify the file path. So we're going to do images, so the name of the folder that they're in, and then slash, and then the name of the image. It's going to be cooking, and then the extension is JPEG for these, so .jpg. We'll then go ahead and load the other image as well. So this will be my ingredients image, so ing image. This will be equal to a new image. For this one, again, we're going to use that file protocol. So do file. This will again also come from that images folder slash ingredients.jpg. Okay, so once we've got both of these images, then we can also go ahead and create our image views from those images. So we'll say image view. Let's do intro, and then as a shorthand for image view, I'm just going to do IV. So we'll do intro IV is equal to new image view, and we'll just go ahead and put in our intro image. For the other one, we'll go ahead and do image view ingredients ing IV is going to be equal to new image view, and this is going to be using the ingredients image. Okay. So the next thing we're going to need to do, now that we've got our labels and our image views ready to go, we'll go ahead and create our grid pane, and then we'll slowly start to add the content to that grid pane. So let's go ahead and create our grid pane object. So make a grid pane. Call this grid pane using a lowercase g, but keeping the capital P. So be equal to a new grid pane. So at this point, we don't need to add anything else to this line. We're just going to use that empty constructor to kind of initialize our grid pane. Once we've got this, then we'll go ahead and start adding our content. So the best order to go in will probably be to start at the top left corner, and then we'll kind of just go through the columns of that first row, and then move down and go through the columns of the next row. For this particular one, it's essentially going to be a 2x2 square, since we have 4 items that we need to add to this, 2 labels and 2 images. The way that I'm going to do this is I want to put the intro image in the top left corner. We're going to put the intro label right next to that in that top right corner. We're going to do the ingredients label in the bottom left corner, and then we're going to do the ingredients image or image view in the bottom right corner. So we'll then go ahead and do gridpane.add. We'll first start by adding the intro IV, the intro image view. This is going to be at column 0, row 0. We'll then go ahead and do another gridpane.add. This is going to be for the label, so that intro label. This is going to be at column 1 and row 0. Then do another gridpane.add. This is going to be for the ingredients label, so ing label. This is going to be at column 0, but row 1. And then finally, go ahead and do one more gridpane.add. And this is going to be for the ingredients image. This will be in that lower right corner, so that's going to be at column 1, row 1 for the ingredients image view. Okay, so now that we've got our grid pane and we've got all the content that we want to put inside of it, now we'll go ahead and just set up our scene and then display this, and we'll take a look at how this application is looking initially. So a scene, call that scene with a lowercase s. This will be equal to a new scene. For this particular one, we're going to be using the grid pane as our root node. And for the dimensions on this, right now, I'll need to take a look to see how large these images are going to be. Good chance that we'll need to modify that. We'll also probably end up taking a look at the spacing, alignment for our grid pane. Probably have to make some modifications to that. So we'll go ahead and run this first just to see how all the content is looking, and then we'll kind of modify it as we go. So to start off with, we'll try something like 1000 by 1000. We'll then go ahead and create go ahead and set our scene in our primary stage. Then go ahead and give this a title. So we'll just give it a title like My Cooking App. And then finally, we'll go ahead and show this. Make sure this application window actually displays. Alright, so now that we've got all this, we'll go ahead and run it and see how this initially looks and what all we'll need to clean up. So the immediate thing that we can see is that the images are in fact too large. So we can kind of stretch this out a little bit to see them, but we'll definitely need to go ahead and modify those dimensions so that this is actually visible for most monitor sizes. We can also see that the content, so this image and this label, are both kind of pressed against each other on this edge. There's also no spacing between these two rows, so the corners of these images touch up against each other right here. If, for example, we were going to use multiple images, they would all be pressed right against each other. So we can clearly see that we want to make some modifications to both the image sizes as well as adjusting for the spacing. Additionally, we can see that this image has no padding. Perhaps if we adjust the dimensions and also set the alignment to something more centered, that might resolve that problem. It could also be that we should add some padding to this, so we'll take a look at that as well. So we'll go ahead and close this. We'll come back over here for just a moment. So there are a couple of other parameters that we can set for our GridPane layout. These are going to include things like grid lines. We can also specify gaps. These will be essentially the equivalent of spacing. And just like with our HBox and VBox, we can also set padding. So with grid lines, we have this option, the set grid lines visible, if we want to be able to see the grid lines of our GridPane container. So essentially these grid lines would just show you the separation of the different items in the rows and columns. In this particular case, with what we just created, it would essentially show you the 4x4 squares for each of the 4 different pieces of content. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and skip over this one. If you'd like to be able to test this, you can just add this line of code to your application. The primary one that I'm going to be focusing on that's new to GridPane is going to be these 2 different types of gaps. So we've got our H gap and our V gap for horizontal and vertical gaps. So with the horizontal gap, this is going to set a gap between the different rows, and with a vertical gap, this will set a gap between the different columns. So we'll go ahead and incorporate that. We'll also include some padding, and as I mentioned, we'll go ahead and also modify the dimensions for our images. Let's go ahead and minimize this and come over here. So to start with, let's go ahead and start first by getting these images out of the way. So we've got our 2 image views right here. We'll also go ahead and make sure that we set the aspect ratio, or preserving the aspect ratio to be true. So we're going to go ahead and do intro IV. We'll do set preserve ratio. We'll use that one, set that to true. We'll then go ahead and specify something for the dimension on this. So let's say in this particular case, we want to try to keep the height for our images the same. We'll just let it automatically adjust the width as needed. So let's say for intro IV, we're going to go ahead and do set fit height. And let's say for these, we want to use a height of something like, if we're doing 1,000 by 1,000 and we want to center this later, maybe we'll do something like 300 for the height. We'll see what kind of effect that has on the overall dimensions. We'll go ahead and do the same thing with our ingredients image view. We'll set the preserve ratio to be true, and we'll also go ahead and set the height to be 300. I'll go ahead and save that much. And then right here, so we've set up our GridPane, we've set some content inside of it. So let's say that maybe after we set the content, we'll also go ahead and set the style or the structure of it. So we'll go ahead and do GridPane.set, let's say set HGap, put in a value of 10. So we'll have 10 pixels of spacing between the rows. We'll then do set VGap, do another 10 pixels between the columns. In addition to this, we'll also go ahead and set the alignment. So for this particular part, since I am working in NetBeans for this, I'm just going to go ahead and write out this line. It's going to end up using the pause class, but when it does, I'll just go ahead and automatically add that import. So we'll go ahead and do GridPane.set alignment. And right here, we're going to do pause.center. So I'm going to use that one. So it looks like with me automatically completing that, it also went ahead and added the import. So if we double check at the very top, yeah, we can see right here, we've included this import for the pause class from that geometry package. Okay, so now that we've got everything for that, go ahead and save this, and we'll run it again, take another quick look at how the content is being displayed. Alright, so this is starting to look a fair bit better. So we've got our two images right here. We can also see our two labels. One last thing that we're still noticing though is that we do still have the images kind of pressed against the edges. We can also see that with this this label right here. So we still need to be able to go ahead and adjust that a little bit more. So let's go ahead and actually add some padding for these images instead. So it seems like the alignment doesn't really accomplish much of anything that we need. So let's go ahead and remove that one. We'll just comment it out. So if you want to still kind of mess around with that, you're welcome to do that. So let's go ahead and do GridPane.set padding. Again, just like with pause, this is going to end up using one of those classes from that geometry package. So I'll just do new insets. And let's just do 10 pixels of padding. And then right here, let's go ahead and add that import for javafx.geometry.insets. Go up to the top to double check that. And we can see that being added right here. Okay, so go ahead and save this. And with this new adjustment, we'll go ahead and run this again and see how that looks. So close the original, and we'll run this again. Okay, so looks like it's giving us everything. The main problem with this image, now that we're looking at this, is that it's still a little bit too long. So one of the adjustments we can go ahead and make might be to go ahead and adjust this to something more like 1200 pixels. And it looks like at least one of the useful things about GridPane is that it's keeping it vertically centered. So maybe we want to go ahead and reduce the height of this a little bit more, maybe more like 800. But we can also go ahead and keep this centering. So maybe go ahead and try something like this and see how that looks. And I just realized I put the dimensions in reverse. So this should be 1200 by 800. Try that. And now we actually have something that looks pretty good. Okay. So now we've got each one of our images being displayed. We've got our two labels right next to each other. At this point, it kind of looks like with that extra little bit of width that this has done a much better job of fixing the problem that we had before. So maybe you don't necessarily need that padding. I'll leave that line in as well, just as another thing that you can kind of play around with, supposing that you want to be able to add some more content to this beyond just this grid pane. Alright, so that'll complete everything for that. So coming back over here. So to wrap up on containers, the last thing to mention here that we saw a little bit already was this idea of nested containers. So you can actually put one container inside of another. In this example that I'm showing right here, we are actually creating an HBox. So this HBox will consist of a label on the left-hand side, and then it's going to have a VBox on the right-hand side. And inside of that VBox, we can see a text field and a button. So those would be the two items of that VBox. From the example that we looked at in our program, we did it with an HBox inside of a VBox. So we had that HBox with 3 labels, and then we had a VBox with that HBox and 2 more labels. So now what I want to go ahead and do to kind of wrap up on this section is to go ahead and take a look at the scene graphs and sketches for both that setup with the nested containers, and we'll also go ahead and take a quick look at the scene graph and the sketching for our grid pane with our cooking app that we made. So to take a look at the scene graph for our first application, so it's going to be the one where we used the VBox and the HBox. So the VBox ended up being the root node of that scene. So we'll go ahead and place that at the top of our scene graph. So we're going to put that about right here. So this will be for our VBox. Go ahead and place that here. And then underneath this, for all of the content in this VBox, we had our HBox and our 2 other labels. We're going to go ahead and include that underneath it. So first we'll go ahead and make the HBox, since that was the top item inside of that VBox. So this will be HBox. Place that here. And then inside of that HBox, we had 3 labels, first, second, and third label. So go ahead and add each one of those. Let's place that after. So, but right here, we'll have each of those 3 labels. So we've got first label, second label, and third label. So each one of those will be connected up to the HBox. So VBox is a root node, HBox is going to, in this case, be a branch node, and then first, second, and third label will each be leaf nodes. And then underneath all of that, we'll have the fourth and fifth labels, which will be 2 more leaf nodes that are directly attached to the VBox. So this will be our fourth label. And this will be our fifth label. Okay, so this will give you the scene graph for that particular application. If we then want to go ahead and take this scene graph and try to make a simple sketch of our application from it, we can go ahead and take a look at that as well. So we'll go ahead and remove all of this. So if we take a look at our application window, inside of that application window, we know that the VBox is going to be the root node, so that's going to be our topmost container. So we know we're going to have something kind of like this at the very top. And then inside of that container, we're going to have 3 things. The first is going to be an HBox, so we know that we're going to need something that kind of spans the entire width of that box. And then we're going to have 2 labels. So those 2 labels might be, we could picture them as being slightly smaller in dimensions. And so then inside of this HBox, we're going to have 3 more items for each one of those 3 labels. So then we're going to have, say, our first label, our second label, and then our third label. Okay. So at the very least, let's do first, second, and third. So at least fit as much as we can into those. For these 2, we'll just go ahead and say fourth label and fifth label. Okay. So this gives you a general idea about how each one of the different items are going to be positioned relative to one another when you take a look at just a simple sketching of it. And so then from here, you can start to create that actual implementation that we saw in our program. In addition to this, we can also take a look at the scene graph and the initial sketching for our cooking app with a GridPane. So for that one, this one's a bit simpler since it's just the GridPane for our container. So we have our GridPane, and then for that GridPane we have 4 items. So if we go in that same order, going from left to right and then top to bottom, we've got 4 items to put into this. The first is going to be our intro image view. The second is going to be our intro label. And then it's going to be our ingredients label. And then our ingredients image view. So those will be the 4 items that make up that application, or the contents of that GridPane layout. And then connect all these together. And so for this one, what we're looking at is just a single root node for the GridPane. and then 4 leaf nodes for each of the 4 items inside of it. And then if we want to actually construct this application, say maybe we can do it in this corner right here. For this particular one, we're looking at just a single grid pane. I can kind of imagine that encompassing most, but not necessarily all of the content of the application. And then inside of it, we've got 4 items in that 2x2 fashion. So essentially each one of these 4 corners like so. For this one, I'll mark this down as primarily just image view or label. Maybe the whole thing will fit. Let me try that. So now that we've got our ingredients image view, ingredients label, got our intro label, and we've got our intro image view. So this shows us the relative positioning that we want for this particular application. Alright, so this is going to wrap up everything for our different types of containers, at least the ones that we've covered so far. We'll have one more that we want to cover a little bit later. The next part that we're going to focus on, though, is going to be looking at how we can start implementing buttons in our applications and also giving those buttons some kind of functionality.